Low traffic neighbourhoods, they are far from new to London. I've been living one here in deepest Hackney for at least 20 years. But the array of LTNs, as we call them for short, that has recently appeared from Ealing to Lambeth, from Croydon to Redbridge, has triggered renewed debate about them, some of it fierce. So the idea of LTNs is to reduce or prevent residential streets being used by motorised through traffic in order to thwart rat running, improve air quality and make streets more tranquil and hospitable, including, perhaps especially, for pedestrians and cyclists. In COVID-battered London, they have been introduced in large numbers at short notice, with government money distributed by TfL, 160 of them across 21 boroughs. The additional aim of these new schemes is to aid social distancing and help prevent a car-led recovery, a car-led economic recovery, in the context of people's anxiety about using public transport. So some people love LTNs, and for all the reasons and the intentions I've mentioned, but some people really hate them. Why is that? There seem to be a number of reasons. For example, that they are considered inconvenient for resident motorists. They displace motor traffic elsewhere, creating jams and problems for neighbouring residential streets, or that they've been introduced too quickly without the usual prior consultation, although doing that was in fact part of the deal with the government for getting the money. For some critics, they've simply been rather badly done. And that's a conclusion that Lewisham Council seems to have come to about its own LTN. For other people, it's about something much bigger than that. One anti-LTN campaigner in Islington has claimed that they are actually designed to drive out the last of the working class. Boroughs are reacting in different ways. Conservative-run Wandsworth, as Leonie, one of our panellists, knows, has suspended all its LTNs, while Labour Hackney is defending its LTNs very strongly. In Ealing, their implementation has led to a no confidence vote by Labour councillors in their own leader, one that he only very narrowly survived. And some residents there have launched a legal challenge. Conservative London Assembly member Keith Prince has been fiercely critical of an LTN in Redbridge, including at Mayor's Question Time today. But LTN opinion doesn't split entirely along party lines, as one of our panellists will demonstrate. So let's get to those panellists now. Each will have 6 minutes to say their piece, and I will pick up on a few points, but also leave some time for questions from our audience. By the end, we may not have agreement, but perhaps we will have at least a clearer idea of what the various sides think and how their differences might be resolved. Our first speaker is Caroline Russell, a London-wide Green Party London Assembly member and the only non-Labour councillor in Islington. So that's North London represented. Our second speaker will be Puru Miah, who is a Labour councillor from Tower Hamlets. That's East London. Thirdly, from South London, as already mentioned, Leonie Cooper, who's Assembly member for Merton Wandsworth and leader of the Labour group on Wandsworth Council, where LTNs have been suspended. And finally, from North London, in Enfield, close by the North Circular, OnLondon's own star contributor, Charles Wright, who lives within an LTN and is reported for by website OnLondon on the range of local attitudes among his friends and neighbours. So Caroline, over to you. You have 6 minutes and I'm going to be very, very strict. Okay.
Thank you very much. And hello, everyone. So it's a really difficult time for Transport for London. They're incredibly short of cash because everyone has stopped using the tube and the buses in the same way that they usually do. So they are dependent on government bailouts, and one of the things that they're allowed to do with the government bailout money is introduce low traffic neighbourhoods. Now, at the beginning of this year, before coronavirus struck, things were not that great in terms of transport. Thanks to smartphones and GPS, What were once little known shortcuts used by cabbies are now really busy rat runs cutting through residential neighbourhoods. And there's been a huge increase in traffic on these minor roads over the last 10 years. And road transport is the biggest unaddressed sector in terms of carbon emissions, which need to be reduced. And also, there is a crisis of physical inactivity that is harming public health and that needs to be addressed. So low traffic neighbourhoods are actually addressing a whole load of issues, public health, as well as helping to provide people with an alternative to getting on the bus or the tube while we're needing to stay physically apart from one another. They're an emergency measure, and it is about changing the streets so that each residential road has access to one main road. And it's really important for a successful low traffic neighbourhood that you choose the boundary roads correctly and you don't end up with a boundary road that is a residential road that really is not a main road carrying that boundary road traffic. So the boundaries are really need a lot of thinking about. The point is that a low traffic neighbourhood makes it less convenient to drive, and particularly for those short journeys that take 5 or 10 minutes, it may well be very inconvenient to drive those journeys if your home is attached to a different main road than the one that you need to get to. But that's the point of this. This is about trying to get that change in behaviour, because if everyone who used to travel on the bus or the tube decides to get in a car, we will just have absolute gridlock and a really bad pollution spike, which you do not want during an ongoing respiratory pandemic. So there are things we need to control. We need to control the volume of travel using motorised vehicles. We need to control where that comes from each vehicle. And no one measure is going to do all three of those things. So we have measures which I think the Mayor should be bringing in, and which hopefully he will at some point: smart, fair, privacy-friendly road pricing, where people pay per mile by their engine emissions and by the availability or not of public transport. We have measures like 24/7 bus lanes, which make bus journeys more reliable. We have measures like the ultra-low emission zone, which is tackling pollution from each vehicle. It also tackles where people go, but it's by next October. But it is already in central London having an impact on pollution levels for NO2 across the whole of our city. And then there are measures like low traffic neighbourhoods, pop-up bike lanes, widening pavements, which aren't going to solve all the problems, but they are going to make a huge difference for very low, relatively low amounts of money. So a low traffic neighbourhood isn't the whole solution, but in the context of those other wider measures, it really makes a difference. Now, this morning at Mayor's Question Time, the Mayor said to me, disabled people are more likely to rely on walking or catching the bus. So that walking environment needs to be inclusive. It needs tactile paving, dropped curbs, even, smooth pavements, and roads that feel safe to cross. And that's what you get in a low traffic neighbourhood, because you lose the through traffic and people are able to get around safely under their own steam. So I'm in favour of low traffic neighbourhoods because they reduce people's exposure to road danger, they reduce exposure to air pollution, and they create inclusive streets where children, older and disabled people are able to get around independently. Now, I've seen low traffic neighbourhoods all over London, I think the pleasure of seeing young children walking and cycling independently on their way to school is just wonderful. And my feeling is that low traffic neighbourhoods need improving, not removing. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. Puru, over to you, sir.
Can everyone hear me first?
I can, certainly, yeah.
Okay, cool, brilliant. Okay, first I want to thank the London Society and OnLondon and Dave Hill for inviting me here to this important debate on low traffic neighbourhoods, an issue that has agitated many Londoners. We're here discussing this issue here virtually at the London Society, one of the oldest civic society in our country, encouraging public interest and participation in urban planning and transport matters in London. Now, we all agree that people and communities should be at the heart of urban planning. People should come first before bricks and mortars or asset values. And it is from that perspective that I want to argue in this debate. My opposition to low traffic neighbourhoods is not on the basis of the principle of the low traffic neighbourhoods, but how they're being applied. A myopia by policymakers penalising working class communities for whom the car is a necessity, not a choice, a means of income and not a luxury. Yes, climate change is a real emergency, should be addressed on an equitable basis, not on the back of the working poor. Now, I'll be using my observations from my experience as a councillor and resident of Tower Hamlets and the East End. Tower Hamlets is the third richest local authority in England, bordering the City of London, and has the financial district of Canary Wharf. Yet it has the highest levels of poverty in the country, one of the highest child poverty rates, one of the highest concentrations of intergenerational overcrowding, and has high levels of deprivation amongst the over 60s. Yes, it was once a centre of manufacturing of industrial London, but manufacturing is gone, but the communities who used to provide labour to those factories are still here, now working in the service economy linked to the nighttime economy serviced by the largesse of our financial centres, employed in labour-intensive, low-paying, precarious employment where the car is not a luxury, but a means of income, employed as delivery drivers, cabbies, tradesmen, retail and leisure and hospitality, working in poverty rather than working out of poverty. I just want to illustrate an example. In my ward, I have estates where nearly a third of the household income is £18,000 or less. And it's through intergenerational support that families mitigate the effects of poverty, where the family car is a means of accessing care and support for those who are vulnerable yet living independently, something which Lord Young illustrated in his seminal work, Family and Kinship in East London. It's the same working, and if you look at, yet when the COVID crisis hit, it's the same working class communities that came to the forefront that kept our society alive, working in retail, delivery, and with the nurses, all in low employment. Yet COVID-19 has exposed the vulnerabilities of these communities, decades of failed urban regeneration and economic development. Tower Hamlets has one of the youngest populations, yet recorded more than 10% of all total London deaths. At one point, at the height of the pandemic, cemeteries were turning away bodies from Tower Hamlets, and the way they had, and in the end, they had to dig trenches to bury the dead. That's the crisis that we went through, leaving in its wake grieving families who are now facing an economic fallout in the same magnitude as the Great Depression. To illustrate, I want to give two examples from my ward. On my ward, in Burdett Road, I have 100 small independent businesses. Nearly all of them have told me that they've witnessed a drop in their turnover to 50% or 2/3. Also, looking at the food bank in my ward, it's risen from 60 households to over 600 who need support, and it's growing by the day. Now, it's an insult to these people at the bottom of the socioeconomic ladder, double victims of the pandemic, to roll out LTNs, low traffic neighbourhoods, that have a detrimental effect to their income and support network, at the same time using COVID-19 as an excuse. It's an insult. That's what it is. In fact, studies on the Mill in Holland scheme on Waltham Forest has shown that there hasn't been any tangible reduction in overall air pollution or traffic, but we've actually witnessed increase in property prices, accelerating more so so accelerating more social cleansing, in fact, and gentrification, and providing a growth in effect what are gated communities, dividing neighbourhoods and eroding trust in public institutions, and creating a new culture war in London based on the haves and the have-nots. In London, from my experience and observation, being reliant on a car is not a symbol of affluence. Being reliant not on a car is a symbol of affluence, and is identified by many Londoners. And an attack on the use of the car is viewed as a form of class warfare. That's the view on the streets. Now, as suggested by the chair, I want to offer a framework for more enlightened discussion on the matters of LTNs. In my view, the way LTNs are being implemented, from my experience in Tower Hamlets, they are flouting a basic principle of the rule of law, an expected predominance that is expected by the citizenship of our public institutions. So I just want to use the framework that was given by Lord Bingham in his seminal work, The Rule of Law, where he outlined 8 questions, 8 principles with regards to the rule of law. And I've adapted them with regards to how local authorities, especially my one in Tower Hamlets, is implementing LTNs. For example, are the low traffic neighbourhood schemes accessible, intelligible, clear and predictable? No, they're not. Are disagreements on proposed schemes resolved by the exercise of law or by discretion? They're resolved by discretion. Not. Are schemes being equally applied to all residents? No, they're not. Are local authorities exercising the powers conferred in good faith fairly for the purpose of which they're conferred, reasonably without exceeding the limits of such powers? No, they're not. Do the implementation of such schemes adequately protect fundamental human rights? No, they're not. We're looking at people with protected characteristics, the disability and the elderly being discriminated by this.
Just to butt in, you've gone past your 6 minutes. If you can be quick now, we can perhaps come back to some of the other points. If you have
so the consultation is not fair, and the local authorities are not complying with their obligations under the law, the public sector equality duty and the common law duty to consult through the gunning principle. So just by the fact of just this analysis of the rule of law, the way these LTNs are being rolled out is completely unfair, and the outcome to these is not less inequality but more inequality.
Okay.
And that's so we need to stop, have a moratorium, have an audit, sort out the processes, and sort out the outcomes. Thank you.
Thanks very much indeed. Thanks for stopping there. You've only gone a little bit over, so thanks. And Leonie, over to you, please.
Thanks very much, Dave. And like others, I'd just like to say, I think it's really great that both the London Society and OnLondon have decided to host this event. I think Caroline has mentioned a few of the really important issues, but I think this has become incredibly contested, partly because there has been a definite push by some politicians to use this as a deliberate political football, which I have to say I do find a little bit despicable, because you know, we've known for a long time that we are addressing an absolute pandemic in terms of air quality and the problems with air quality. And we also know that the people who are most affected by poor air quality are quite often likely to be from, from families where they've got less resources, less means, those socio-economic groups where people are struggling more. And I think it's really important that we don't forget that that is the original context. And some of us have been trying to work on improving air quality for a long time. But it's also come in the middle of a pandemic that is affecting our health in different ways. And lots of people have, you know, if people who live by themselves may not have actually touched another human for 6 months, people have felt locked into their houses. People are angry and scared. They're worried about their health. Many people, you know, I've lost quite a number of friends now who've died because of the virus. Not so much family members, but really people that are, you know, it was such a shock when they suddenly became ill and passed away very quickly. So I think when suddenly Grant Shapps said, I'm going to force local authorities to bid very quickly for this money. I want you to use emergency traffic orders to implement these schemes. And councils all over the capital scrambled to decide that they wanted to install things very, very quickly. And I think that has set us into a position where whatever the benefits, and Caroline, I think, has started to set out some of the benefits, and lots of people have said to me they have enjoyed, you know, having that space on the street reclaimed from square metal boxes, so that you know, you can use it for other things, children playing out and so on and so forth. But I think it was set up in a way that it made it incredibly difficult for this not to then become totally you know, the source of huge arguments. And certainly you know, we do know that there is also an obesity epidemic. The number of children now who are developing type 2 diabetes, which people didn't used to develop until they were in their 50s or 60s, is shocking. School children under 11 developing type 2 diabetes. It only happens if children are severely obese, and we're not tackling that. We really haven't been tackling that enough. So we need to be moving more. We need to be traveling actively much more. And of course, the more that there are cars on the road, the less likely it is that people will want to scoot to school, take a bicycle to school, or even to walk to school. And you know, it's not true to say that everybody has a car. In London, car ownership is incredibly low. Everybody is a pedestrian. It's impossible to leave your house without walking somewhere. You know, I myself, in fact, I do have a car, but I also have a bicycle, and but I mostly walk. I walk a lot. I also use a lot of public transport, and the easier we make these things, people to switch between different modes of transport or different ways of getting around in our built environment, we need to make it as easy as possible. And one of the problems, and Puru was just touching on this, with the implementation, this very speedy implementation of the low traffic neighbourhoods, certainly around my way, they were signed off by the council at the end of July, and they then had a fortnight before anything was installed anywhere. They hardly communicated enough with people at all. They didn't send out letters. And then when they started putting planters in to block side streets, and that's how people perceived it, as a blockage rather than anything else, because there wasn't even a sign at the end of the road to say, if you come down this road, you are in a car, you are going to have to then try and do a U-turn. So it was appalling. Communicating with people about change, you know, I thought everybody knew that if you want to bring in a big change, that you really have to tell people what you're doing. And then not even to put signs at the end of the road to say, actually, what you can use this road for has been changed. And then the signs were incredibly controversial. They put up signs saying, closed to everyone except cyclists. And so I've literally just this evening just been sent some really offensive tweets showing tombstones and showing hearses and, you know, really nasty stuff. And some of the things that I've seen printed on social media about cyclists has been absolutely horrible. And it's this whole thing of treating cyclists as if they're a group of people over there that we can all throw rocks at or something like that. And we have to bring this debate down. We have to have, if you are going to put things in, you have to tell people what the changes are that you're planning. You have to put signs up and to say properly what you know, how the road has been changed or that area is being altered, and it has to be neutral. There's no point putting in signs that then make people very, very concerned and very angry with cyclists, particularly in this context of people being so concerned and angry at things that have changed in their lives. I favour an incremental approach where you have as much consultation with local people as possible. And once you do install things, that you do make it absolutely clear that there is flexibility, that they are there on a trial basis and that adjustments will be made. So in Wandsworth, there was a huge uproar led by people who don't live in Wandsworth, actually, a lot of them. And in fact, some of them live in their own low traffic neighbourhoods. They jumped up and down. The council then took everything out and they put all the planters down one road. And so we've lost, you know, thousands of petitions have been handed in over the years to safeguard children walking to school. Crossings have been rejected. You know, safety features have been rejected. You know, removing it all is absolutely the wrong.
Leonie, you've gone over your 6 minutes. If you can wind up happy.
Incremental installation, flexibility once you put things in, listening to people, making adjustments, and not pulling it all out. And it's not true to say that it is all based around one group of people only. The community in Tooting down every street is incredibly mixed, and you know, if it's done properly, people can benefit, but this was done very badly. Thank you, Dave.
Thank you very much. Okay, just to say, we've got lots of points being made on the Q&A and in the chat thing, which I'm taking note of, and we'll come back to some of those. But our fourth speaker is Charles, who, just to remind you, is a resident of Enfield and actually lives within a low traffic neighbourhood. He's written a couple of really excellent pieces for OnLondon about local feeling, the sort of spread of local feeling. So I'd be quite interested to, well, you say your piece, Charles, and I'm sure some of the points that have already been made might ring bells with you.
Yes, thanks, Dave, and thanks to London Society. I mean, I'm really, I suppose, going to illustrate what people have said already from my own experience of suddenly finding this big change happening in the streets where I live, and I think particularly Leonie's points. I mean, it's the Bowes neighbourhood, low traffic neighbourhood. It's just under the North Circular in Enfield, the sort of bottom end of Enfield, top end of Haringey, where the North Circular was semi-widened for the Olympics. The other bit of it wasn't. There was a bit of rat running, and what was left was a small road, which is effectively designated as the overspill for the North Circular at the time of the Olympics. It was not a busy road until various other changes happened, like that back in 2007-8, in the lead up to the Olympics. So, you know, what as Leonie has said, I think with very little notice and scant information, we suddenly found that our 13 streets, 7,000 or so households were being closed to all vehicle access, except via the A406 North Circular, which at that point is a 3-lane urban motorway. There's 3 ways out going westward, just one way in and out coming eastward. And to be honest, it was a real shock for people. I think people hadn't really understood the rather inadequate information that had been circulated. Not everyone knows what a filter is, I think. And it was, you know, it was rightly described, I think, as a bombshell. A bombshell to a lot of residents. Not everyone wants to drive in and out of the area via the North Circular, and some journeys are going to be quite a bit longer. And that's actually a comment from Better Streets Enfield, which is one of the key proponents of the low traffic neighbourhoods in Enfield. So I think, you know, what was apparent was you know, suddenly a huge swell of opinion about this, and it was really about, in my view, and I was there, you know, throughout these things. It was about the way it's done. There's no democracy. The sort of comment you hear all the time on these on Facebook and so on. It's a real concern about democracy, about consultation, and not particularly characterized by the sort of angry male petrol heads of the sort of imagination of the perhaps more evangelical proponents of low traffic. I mean, the perhaps slightly reluctant spokesperson for local people, and I think I've just seen him put a comment on, so he's listening in, I think, was you know, more often seen riding his bike round the streets with his 2 small kids on bikes than ever driving a large car. I think the next point then, and again Leonie mentioned this, was that the council, and I don't want to be too critical, I understand the point about wanting the money and being forced to do this quickly, that's correct, but the urgency, that's a concern, and certainly not for the particular design which was being implemented. And we've asked about that. You know, was there a report that was signed off by the relevant cabinet member? Was there any option? Was there an option appraisal? Apparently not, we're told. The whole thing was done through discussion. So could we have a copy of the bid that went in? And apparently that was an online form, and the council didn't keep a copy of that. So the sort of rationale hasn't really been out there at all, and with that creates a sort of vacuum, I think, which you know, can rapidly get filled in less positive ways and on social media and so on. So you get a bit of conspiracy stuff, you know, are these schemes in because the councillors live up those streets and that sort of thing. You've got the sort of somewhat evangelical, slightly patronising stance of some of the proponents of the scheme. It's all for our own good. We just don't know it yet. Plenty of support for the scheme, clearly, because it does cut off a road that carried a lot more traffic than it should. But a real sort of scepticism about consultation, particularly when things get polarised in where they have. I see that Rupert Hutch in Ealing just recently said it's really polarised people between cyclists and motorists. Sort of wider point, I think. But now, if you say you're concerned about the scheme, it's because you want to drive wherever you want, whenever you want, and you really don't give a damn about pollution and young kids' lungs, and that can't be right. It's seen as it's a straight fight between cycling and car use, and that's a quote from the London Cycling Campaign blog, I think in April or possibly May this year. And unsurprisingly, and Leonie's touched on this as well, I think, you know, you end up with a pretty divided community and a polarization which shouldn't really be there. And that's wrong, I think, because there's too much concern. I mean, I've been a local authority councillor. I mean, I've worked at London regional level.
Sorry, just to say, Charles, you've gone over your 6 minutes, so if you can wrap up now.
Yeah, I think there's too much genuine concern about this for it to be dismissed in the way that it sometimes seems to be. You know, the way forward. I mean, I'd probably go back to what Leonie said. It's about pausing, listening, getting better schemes from the start, bringing people with you. I just hope it's not too late for that sort of approach.
Okay, right. Well, that is for excellent presentations there. So let me just pick up a couple of points from them and maybe get a little bit of discussion between the panelists. I mean, this is a very, very crude categorization I'm going to impose on you here now, but there seem to be, broadly speaking, two sets of objection. One is about implementation, lack of consultation, done too quickly, done too badly. That's sort of one set of objections. And then there's the sort of slightly bigger ones about, is this about changing neighbourhoods in the interests of some people, not in the interests of some other people who tend to get forgotten about, which is sort of it sort of reveals a bigger set of anxieties about the speed and manner in which London has been changing a lot in recent times. There's two sorts of things there. So I'd quite like to ask Caroline if you're okay there, and you've been having a few bandwidth problems. Caroline, yeah,
yeah.
So the argument that what's going on in Islington, for example, is something which benefits perhaps the more prosperous residents of Islington, to some degree at least, at the expense of the less affluent. This has been a theme of some of the demonstrations that took place in Upper Street, which you know all about, of course. Do you think there is any force in that argument at all? Those types of argument?
Look, in Islington, there's under 30% of households have access to a car or van. The poorest communities do not have access to cars and vans. And Islington is a very mixed borough. We have every street is pepper potted with different types of tenure. So you can get big old Georgian houses. Some of them are privately owned and are lived in by people, used to be lived in by people who were teachers and, kind of having quite ordinary jobs. But these days, it's quite expensive to buy one of those homes. But there's also some of those homes in that street will be housing association or council owned. So you can't tell who is living in a particular street. It's very mixed. And we also have a lot of the estates are included in the low traffic neighbourhoods. So I don't think that it's fair to say that it is divisive and it is benefiting the more affluent part of Islington's community. We have a council who are really seriously now taking on board the public health implications of very traffic dominated streets. And we need to make sure that we are reducing our exposure to air pollution. It is, air pollution is doing us harm. It's doing us harm with our heart and our lung health. And it is not fair on those communities to leave them exposed to this air pollution without doing something to try and reduce the amount of traffic on the road. Because by giving people alternative options to get around safely, that helps to reduce that traffic. And I just think it's the right thing to be doing.
Okay, so Puru, do you want to come back on that one?
Yeah, I want to come back on that because I think I don't know what experiences Caroline has in Islington, but I could just talk about my experiences as a councillor in Tower Hamlets, and it has divided communities. Tower Hamlets is one of the most unequal places in London. It has sort of like probably a Gini coefficient of a Latin American country rather than a modern Northern European social democracy. And what you've got is in the same geographic area, you've got the super rich and the super poor. And when you have a passive consultation process, especially when you just roll out everything in English, what you're doing is you're actively discriminating and providing barriers. And at the end of the outcome of any sort of consultation discussion, it's one group that wins out over the other. And the schemes, from speaking to local residents, seem to benefit the more affluent residents over the much more poorer ones.
Do you
And
think then,
let's talk about air quality and air pollution. Yes, I agree, air pollution is an issue. But if you look at Tower Hamlets, a lot of the boundary roads are basically bordered by massive social housing estates. And we don't improve the air quality by pushing more traffic onto those boundary roads. So it's just complete. One thing I find kind of an issue is when people speak for people on the lower end of the social demographic ladder. I could tell you their voices are loud and clear. They're against these schemes. They see them as an attack on their income, and it seems like it's gerrymandering or pushing pollution onto roads where they're bordered.
okay, so one of the stated aims of this event is to try and find a sort of some consensual ground between various different sides in this argument. So is the difference between Caroline and Puru, who I'm sure have many things in common, actually, I would think, in terms of politics, although they are of different parties, is it partly to do with a particular, because Tower Hamlets is a different sort of place to much of Islington? Could these disputes, in a sense, have been resolved if the consultation period, there had been a proper consultation period, and different kinds of assessments, fuller assessments made, if it hadn't been in such a rush? Might perhaps, Puru, some of the people in your part of town might have been more willing to go along with it, do you think?
I think they would have. I think one of the dangers of this is that it's eroded trust in public institutions.
Okay.
And that's what it is, the way they're being rolled out. And we're not talking about some temporary fix. It's permanent changes to the physical environment. So it's reminding people that they've been done over. That's what it is. And when you have an erosion of public trust in public institutions, you're opening the doors to all sorts of political forces and all sorts of what Charles was talking about, conspiracy theories. And is that what we want in London, a divided community?
Great, thank you. Caroline, do you want to come back on that? And also I'd be interested to hear what Leonie has to say, because she made a number of points about how she felt that Wandsworth hadn't done this very well, and that was part of the reason that there have been some difficulties there. So Caroline, just want to respond quickly to what Puru said, and then we'll go on to Leonie.
Yeah, very quickly. I mean, there's been a lot of people have been raising things saying, oh, this is really difficult for disabled people, and that's part of the divide that's going on. Now, I've been talking with disabled organisations like Transport for All and Guide Dogs, and they have been talking about things that can be done to make our streets more inclusive, and they welcome less traffic and streets where it is possible to get around under your own steam as a disabled person. Someone I spoke to at Transport for All said it was really, she wanted to be out in the streets, getting around by herself, but actually it's very difficult when streets are so traffic dominated and hostile and dangerous. So there are a lot of good inclusive reasons why we would take these measures, but I do agree that the way it's been messaged has not been clear enough, and I think you have to be absolutely upfront that it is about trying to avoid people driving, it's about trying to avoid terrible congestion, it's about providing people with safe alternatives to getting around in a car.
Okay, thank you very much. Thanks. Can I just pick up a couple of the comments that are messages that have been left, because a person called Gillian who says belonging to the older and disabled group and mainly a public transport user, I can say categorically that the LTNs in my area have increased traffic jams and only through a main road in the area, and worsened air pollution, long delays for buses and so on. So you can see that perhaps we have to agree that every scheme is different. I mean, that might be a way through that one.
Come back there, because 24/7 bus lanes are transforming the bus reliability and keeping all that traffic out of the bus lanes, so the buses are moving reliably. So it is a combination of measures that's needed.
Okay, and also in the messages, several from someone called Ruth, who I think I might know from Twitter, who makes the point. I've lost this particular comment now, but she makes the point that car ownership is actually very low, and a couple of other people have said that in London generally. So maybe there is a sense in which it is a minority in many places. But Leonie, we were going to come to you. So do you want to pick up on any of the things that have already been said in the rather different context of Wandsworth? I mean, if you'd been running Wandsworth Council instead of the Conservatives, would everything have been marvellous, do you think? Or do you think there would still have been some resistance from local people? You're muted.
I'd like to say that, but I'm muted. No, I'd like to say everything would be rosy in the garden. No, I think any process of change, anything where you change things for people, it can necessarily create issues for people, particularly if they feel as though they're having it done to them. And I think that's an important point that we mustn't lose sight of. And I think Puru has expressed that very strongly, because I don't think it's helpful when you do that. I mean, in Wandsworth, you could argue that there was a sort of pent-up demand for change, because Labour councillors had been handing in a lot of petitions saying, what about a zebra crossing near this school? What about a school street? A lot of those things had all been rejected. And I think if you insist on not doing anything but saying, well, we need to get the money from TfL and we won't spend any of our, and frankly, Wandsworth has got money, so it could have been spending, it's got a huge amount of SIL has come in, community infrastructure levy, because it's got all the developments in Wandsworth along the river. So we could have been doing some of these changes, small changes, incremental changes over a period of years. And I think people adjust to that a lot better, and you can consult them as well. But I think the other point is the thing about Puru was also talking about the particular case of Tower Hamlets. Tower Hamlets is a very small borough. Car ownership is actually quite low in Tower Hamlets, but it's very small. people, and you find rich people right next to poor people. What happened in Wandsworth is very different, and I think this is true in a number of other boroughs. Wandsworth is a much larger borough, and the LTNs, the low traffic neighbourhoods, were only installed in Tooting. They covered almost the whole of Tooting. And, you know, in years gone by, when people from black and minority ethnic communities actually found it hard to get onto the council's waiting lists, they tended to buy houses in slightly cheaper parts of town. So the people that live down all the streets where the low traffic neighbourhoods have been implemented in Wandsworth are, you know, incredibly mixed communities, and Tooting is obviously famous for having, you know, particular shopping is available, and there is an influx of people who do drive to come to the mosque. But if the research that's been done shows that most people who go shopping in Tooting, incredibly good public transport connections, lots of buses, Tooting Broadway, Tooting Beck, Balham tube stations, all along the A24. So I'm not entirely sure that I'm buying the argument that, you know, it discriminates against people from particular backgrounds. However, whoever you are, you know, I think being consulted and good communications about a massive change that's coming in, really good neutral signage, and making sure that people understand why you're doing it. And I think the gap between installing things in August, when it did look as though the virus might have been going away a bit, and the sort of earlier periods when people needed that extra space to socially distance on pavements and there was almost no traffic, you know, I think it would have been much more helpful if it had been done earlier. So the connection with change and COVID and, you know, the rushed money, I think that, you know, it did become a bit tenuous for a lot of people.
Okay, of course, we were told that there, at one point, that this is a race against the getting active travel stuff together. There was a race against time, you know, the fight against the car-led recovery and so on. There was a lot of that. But sorry, I'm very mindful of the time. Before we get on to Charles, I just want to pick up a couple of very good contributions that have come in. So Alex Ingram pointing out that saying 70% of households with no car. How does Puru think his council should aim to give those households access to transport that supports the poorest and most vulnerable in society? Which is a good question. We may not have no time to address at the moment. Andy Bowman, the problem could be summarised by the statement that the roads through urban areas are historic and not designed for vehicles. The car has been imposed on the historic layout, which is an interesting point. Richard Mearns picks up this theme of LTNs being, as he puts it, forced upon local residents with no consultation. Charles, let's go to you, Mr. Nuance himself. What have you picked up from what's been said and some of the exchanges of views that we've had before you?
I mean, Nuance is right. I think it's. I noticed a comment there saying there's very few people in support of low traffic neighbourhoods, and I mean, I think, you know, it's fair. And I think you'd said earlier, you know, where you live, there was a low traffic neighbourhood which wouldn't have been called that. It would have been called something like, you know, cutting off a cut through, or in the pejorative term, the rat run. And there's plenty of those around, and I guess controversial. Maybe they were at the time. I mean, there was one in my road. Somehow a mood has arisen, you know, which and the key, the reason for that, I think, is the government saying you can have your house if you get it all done within 8 weeks, and yes, the use of experimental traffic orders, which in my view are probably inappropriate for major changes, which mean you one way in and out is directly onto a 3-lane urban motorway.
Okay.
And I appreciate councils doing that, and you know, I actually appreciate you know, having a pretty quiet road which used to have a bit of traffic. I mean, I shouldn't say a bit, which used to have a fair amount of traffic at rush hour times. But the, you know, the benefits, the disbenefits, you know, they're really being properly assessed. And would it have been too much to do 3 weeks worth of consultation and actually explain what these things were about, and you wouldn't have everybody shouting each other on
Okay, so that's a really interesting point. Because so maybe there maybe there is a bit of potential for common ground there among your three fellow panelists, who obviously, you know, each have their own differences of opinion, but all of them, I think, of all three, Puru and Caroline and Caroline and Leonie have said that the way this has been handled wasn't very good. I mean, was there? Can we agree, all of us, perhaps, that I don't know, maybe there was a bit too much of a sense of emergency and things were just done a bit too quickly? Even, as Charles said, a little bit of time for consultation, a little bit more preparation time. Would that have helped Puru's objectors in Puru's neck of the woods, for example? Karen, I'd like to hear from all three of you, if possible. Do you want to go first, Puru, as you had your hand up?
Yeah, I think a little bit more time, and I think we need a little bit more data. I know people have been banding around the 30% car ownership in Tower Hamlets, but the actual impact of car ownership, car use is much greater, because you've got families who rely on intergenerational support, and you've got small independent businesses who rely on car as well. So the impact is actually much more great. And we've had a debate around the parking changes in Tower Hamlets, where the mayor had to do a U-turn in full council after those concerns were raised. So I think we need a bit more time, a bit more data as well, and a bit more clearer processes that are transparent and fair. But at the moment, it seems like these are arbitrary and they're riling people up the wrong way.
Caroline, so do you feel, I mean, obviously there are going to be retrospective consultations, aren't there? So are you optimistic about those, perhaps?
I think it's really important that they did do this work with experimental traffic orders. That gives people a chance to react to the actual things on the ground and see how it works. Councils can tweak and adapt them, but I think we're living through a global pandemic. We need to provide people with an alternative to using the bus and the tube, because we have to maintain our physical distance. I think it was absolutely right that they are moving these forward with experimental traffic orders. What I think they could do better is explain to people what's going on, why this is being done, and how it will help, and also be clear about the things that, the things that can be changed. So for instance, they're taking out a bike lane on the Euston Road. They are reacting and they are changing things, but they need to, we were never consulted on the massive growth in traffic. We were never consulted on having all these cars parked in our streets. When I was a child, I was taught never cross the road between parked cars. Children growing up in London have no choice but to cross the road between parked cars. We're exposing children to traffic danger every single day, and we were never asked about that. So I think we have to really think about what we want for our city, how we're going to manage public health, and how we're going to make sure that we have a physically active and safe population.
Thanks, Caroline. Leonie, please come in now.
Thank you. I mean, I think, we were never also consulted about the invention of the sat-nav and Waze and all of these things that have sent absolutely huge numbers of vehicles down what used to be little side streets. So I think that point about traffic, also the growth in the number of diesel vehicles and SUVs, which absolutely clog up the side streets and the main roads. The number of those vehicles coming onto the roads has been huge, and that has never been controlled. And so that as diesel private vehicles having increased in number, the air quality has massively gone down. But I do think I made some points about flexibility and adjustments and incrementally introducing, and I do think actually having consulted local people who quite often will know best about how to change things for a few weeks beforehand, then the amount of tweaks and adjustments might have been reduced, and we might not have had so many situations where people have been really angry about installations that haven't made sense in their local area because they came in. And I do really think that a bit of consultation first, and then proper comms about why it was being done and what was coming in, and then making it clear that it was still open to adjustments and there was flexibility. Obviously in my area, people are now absolutely depressed. I'm being inundated with people contacting me saying, well, they may not have been perfect, but you know, taking them all out, what a ridiculous thing to do. Are they going to be forced to give all the money back? I mean, people are quite angry that they've gone now. So,
okay.
Yeah.
Thanks, Leonie. Let's just want to highlight a couple of other comments. I mean, so Julia, to all panelists and attendees, it's really tricky. We absolutely need consultation, but how do we balance with doing the right thing if the people are against the measures that benefit majority overall? Smoking ban, reduction of cars, more active travel measures and infrastructure. And further down, Anne, absolutely agree that the democracy or lack of has been so depressing. Residents treated like subjects. Enfield Council failed to set out their rationale and communicate well, she says. And councillors block dissenting voices on Twitter, she says. And I'm sure she's not making it up. And we have Alessandra, who's a councillor in Haringey. This is interesting. Haringey is one of the London boroughs where LTNs have not arrived yet. In my Alexandra ward, we've been campaigning for the council to get one for 1 or 2 years, but because of the Bowes Quiet Zone, the place where Charles lives, we're worried about displaced traffic. So you've got traffic that's not in Charles's network of streets that's now crowding into Alessandra's, and this is one of the sort of possibly unforeseen consequences of this. And Alessandra asked, how do we bring with us residents who are still sceptical about this? And these are really big, important questions. Charles, do you want to pile in and say a bit more about some of these things?
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, clearly, one low traffic neighbourhood surrounded by a lot of non-low traffic neighbourhoods, will cause issues, and it certainly does. And I think Puru's point about data was quite interesting, actually. I think there's a lack of it, or a lack of recent or up-to-date data, and a lot of stuff gets thrown around in a rather propagandistic way. I suspect, and I mean, I say, you said nuance. I actually really like the idea that you get some proper data and use it. And I was disappointed that Enfield weren't able to produce traffic counts on roads in a particularly accessible form. I don't know if I mentioned earlier, but 19 separate files downloadable if you did it within a few days, and none of them marked as to which road it was, and so on. It doesn't make it easy, and yet, constantly told 10,000 vehicles a day go down this road. Well, let's see that, it's not so difficult. And the other, there's a lot of stuff about how half of car journeys are under 3 kilometres, which actually surprises me somewhat. It's a 2013 figure, and to know a bit more about that would be really interesting, because people sitting where I am, having to drive out onto the North Circular every day, sort of feel a little bit singled out, when the costs of driving are not equitably distributed. The congestion charge doesn't operate across the whole of London. There isn't a sensible, there isn't a nuanced, again, traffic road pricing scheme in place. Costs are not distributed between the people who buy the cars and those who don't, and so there's a sort of there's a slight sense of and I barely use a car at all, and yet it's all down to me apparently too, and I appreciate it's all got to start somewhere, but it's
okay,
not as well handled as it could be, I think.
Okay, one other point that's just come up on the chat thing from Sonia Marinello. To all panelists, she says, stop this rat run propaganda. They are public roads funded by the public purse. This is akin to building walls around these areas. Anybody want to express sympathy with that view? Puru does.
Yeah, I think we need to move away from this idea of gated communities. If we're going to apply things, we should apply them equally. What we're doing is creating postcode lotteries of winners and losers, and it's very arbitrary, and that's what's riling people up. It's an issue of democracy, and what it is, you know, it's so unfair that it's riling people up, and it's going to do permanent damage in our political economy. I think it was John Locke who said that where law ends, tyranny begins, and people, if you've seen throughout history, people always resist tyranny, and that's what people, using that strong language, that's what some people think, and it's growing, that sentiment of arbitrary public institutions.
Okay, and we've got a comment from SEMA, which the panelists who are more in favour of LTNs might want to respond to. A lot of poor people live on main roads because houses are cheaper, and people live who don't, where there are places where people live who don't have other choices. We need to find solutions to air quality on these roads. So, Caroline.
Yeah, this is why I was talking about having to do multiple things. We've got to bring the pollution from each vehicle down. We have to reduce the overall volume of travel using vehicles, and we've got to control where vehicles go. Now, that's why we need measures like road pricing that Charles mentioned, the ultra low emission zone, the 24-hour 7 bus lanes. You know, it's not one thing that is going to solve all these problems, but low traffic neighbourhoods we're seeing in Waltham Forest, where there's really good evidence coming from those schemes that have now been in for a few years. We're seeing real evidence about people changing the way they travel, and that's because they're being given alternatives. Now, they are doing lots of work on the main roads in Waltham Forest, as well as doing the low traffic neighbourhoods in the side roads. But we're in a global pandemic. There is an absolute crisis in funding at Transport for London. They have very little money, and what they've been given has been to introduce some low traffic neighbourhoods. We have to see this in the context of all the other work the Mayor is doing on the ultra low emission zone, the bus lanes, everything else, to try and get a whole package of measures to make our city work. But if everyone who came off a bus or a tube decided to get in a car tomorrow and drive, we would just have gridlock, no one would go anywhere, and that is really not going to help us in our current situation.
Leonie.
I completely agree with Caroline. I mean, you know, before Sadiq and I were elected, we visited Putney High Street, and, you know, I've been doing air quality campaigning for many years, and I was really pleased to go back 2.5 years later with him in March 2017 and launch the first of London's low emission bus zones, and you know that affects all the buses that run through Putney High Street and then beyond it. And we've now got 12 low emission bus zones. There's a huge program from TfL to retrofit the buses. You know, we need to get more electric buses, hybrid buses, hydrogen buses, and that's just one part of the transport on the road. Sorting out what happens with private vehicles, because there are so many of them, is absolutely critical. We've also been looking at taxis, and the launch first of the T-Charge, then the smaller central London ultra low emission zone, followed next October in a year's time by the much enlarged ultra low emission zone. Seems absolutely right. No one should be left behind. No one should be expected to live where there's poor air quality, or they shouldn't be expected to work where there's poor air quality or go to school where there's poor air quality. We have to address it, and that's why all these other measures, there's no one silver bullet. We need a whole series of measures, and that's exactly what the Mayor of London has been implementing against some opposition from lots of different people. But he wants a Clean Air Act. Well, that's what we need. He introduced scrappage so that for poorer people who couldn't get rid of their dirty old cars, they could come forward and change it for and get rid of it and hopefully try some other different form of transport. It's so important for all of us. And if a child's lungs are stunted because they live in a polluted area, they don't grow back. And I go into schools, into primary schools, and I say to children, How many of you use an asthma inhaler? And when I was at school, maybe 1 or 2 children would put their hand up. Now it's whole classes full of children. We are damaging children's health. We have to get on the page on
All
this.
right, Leonie, thank you very much. I've got to, yes, that it was turning into one, but you've got a very nice dog, so we'll make allowances. There's a point here from Paul asking, was government funding strictly for LTNs? I thought it was slightly broader than that. Paul, you are absolutely right. Well, the money that was the funding agreement, which was agreed in May, had a bit in it which said, from the government saying UTfL will agree to spend at least 55 million quid on an ambitious active travel scheme. And that would include, they didn't call them LTNs in that particular document, but this is what they were referring to that. But it's also pop-up cycle lanes, widening pavements, and all the rest of it. So the fact that, and there's a bit more to the finance of that, which I know that the politicians will be better acquainted with than I am. I couldn't get the quick answers out of TfL, but substantial sums of money, and you had to spend it quick. So what I'm going to say as a sort of summing up thing here, listening to you all speak, and trying to think, how can we bring these disparate views together and forge a forward consensus? I would think, got 2 thoughts. They might be rubbish, but let me try them out on you. Every neighbourhood is different. So Puru's spoken, I think, very eloquently about a situation in Tower Hamlets. Tower Hamlets is a very distinctive, special place. All boroughs are distinctive and special. They're all different. There are different circumstances. So the bigger point here, I can remember watching a TV documentary years ago about Northern Ireland, and the very wise BBC correspondent, I can't remember who it was, said, people say, how did this happen? And he said, one of the best answers I could come up with is a very simple one. Bad government causes a lot of trouble. Bad government causes a lot of trouble. And I think the case could be made. We've seen quite bad government at the very highest level, and perhaps some fairly bad government at the lowest level as well. Whilst we appreciate these things there was a lot of pressure to do these things quickly. Maybe it's a bit better to be a bit slower and do them well. I don't know. Is that a reasonably consensual point to end upon? Don is smiling, so I'll take that as a yes. Thank you so much to everybody, to all the panelists who've been terrific, and to everybody who's left messages and put in stuff to the Q&A. I'm sorry I couldn't mention everybody. But you've made a tremendous contribution, and I do hope that everybody feels this event has been worthwhile and constructive.